Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Tonight, we are going to talk about guided reading. And before we jump right into guided reading, I think we also need to address the big pink elephant in the room that is, what exactly do the other students in your classroom do so that you can actually get to some guided reading or, in fact, guided instruction in general. So we're going to cover both of those ideas tonight. I'm going to share with you what has worked for me in my classroom so that I can get to guided reading, and maybe what you can do to change your mindset about what that can look like so that you can be more successful at actually getting some guided instruction done sooner rather than later. But I will be honest, it is the end of October, and I will say I am still not yet ready to do guided instruction in my classroom. I am just at the moment where I'm finishing students' developmental reading assessments, so DRA. So I'm looking at moving in towards guided instruction within November. So before November is over, I hope to have my guided reading up. Now, this is a pretty typical timeline for me with grade 4s and 5s. And that's what normal teaching looks like. So if you're not started guided reading yet, that's okay. I'm not either, but I'm moving toward it, which is why I wanted to talk about it tonight. So if you are new to the show, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty, and I am a junior teacher here in Ontario, Canada, and I'm also the teacher behind madlylearning.com, and I come live every single Monday night to talk about using inquiry-based teaching practices throughout the curriculum, and that definitely includes some guided instruction because inquiry can happen in every part, big or small, in your classroom, whether it's whole group, individual, or even through small group instruction. So I have to say that I often, at the beginning of my career, envied the simplicity of what it seemed like simplicity to me, but envied primary teachers because they just seemed to have a bit of a simpler task in guided reading. Guided reading for primary students was simply just, teaching them how to read. Because students in primary are still at that phase where they are learning how to read. So you're talking about decoding, you're talking about blends and how you sound words out and how you solve words. You're talking about some simple comprehension. So it was always seemed like a bit of a stretch to me to figure out, well, what exactly does guided reading look like in junior? So this took me a while. So it took me a while to kind of figure out what that was going to look like. So what exactly did I do with my older readers when most of them, for the most part, were competent reading? Sure, I still had some that were, say, reading far below grade level, and that I kind of knew what to do with them, but it was what do I do with the rest of my students? So why do I do guided instruction? Well, being the mom of 3, I don't have a lot of time to be spending my evenings marking or planning for that matter. So I found primarily the reason I rely so heavily on guided instruction is because it allows me the most bang for my buck. I can sit with a group of students and I can do a tremendous amount of assessment in the moment through the observations and conversations that I'm having with students. So much so that it actually cuts down on the amount of marking because I don't need to mark absolutely everything that my students do because I have such a really strong picture of what their skills are because I've seen it and I've talked to them about it. So then I just have to collect a product or work sample of them every so often as to round out that triangulation of data. But guided reading really has allowed me to do most of my assessment in the moment with my students, and that is super valuable when I am trying to be more of a stickler of my personal time outside of work. The impossible task that prevents most teachers from getting started in guided reading, and myself included, is the big pink elephant in the room with what. So we were talking about classroom management as it came down to what you could do for guided reading. So we're talking about what the other kids are going to be doing. And I said that there was going to be 3 different components that were going to contribute to your success for what your other kids are doing so that you can actually implement guided reading. The first was having classroom management strategies in place. The second is planning activities that were at a student's independent level, as well as adjusting your expectations as a teacher. So for classroom management, when I'm talking about what your classroom management routines, it's going to take a bit of time to establish what exactly it is that you want your students to be doing in your classroom when they're working independently. One of the biggest things that I need students to be able to do is to be self-sufficient, meaning that I need them to understand that they are capable of solving their own problems without always running to me or expecting me to be the only solution as answers to their problems. So I need to give them the power to be able to solve these problems on their own. I also want to review the routines of things like, what do they do if they have to go to the bathroom? How do they get a new pencil? What happens if they get stuck and aren't sure what to do next? We have to go over the schedule of what independent work looks like. And in fact, I need to run through that schedule for a couple of weeks so that students get really used to it without me having to be with them all the time, monitoring their behavior every step of the way. And I do have a needy class, just like almost every other teacher that is out there. So it is not like I have a group of students that can all just naturally work well independently. That's not typically the case. So it does take me quite a bit of time and effort to establish those routines and rules within my room. It also means that I need to do a good job of focusing on positive behavior and rewarding those students who are doing that, because it does help to reinforce for those other students that we need to make sure that they are being successful. The other piece that I also need to be looking for is that I have to look at the independent activities that I am planning. So I need to make sure that students are very skilled and capable at doing what it is that I have asked them to do. So for this, I typically use centers. And if you're familiar with my Ignited Literacy program, this is what my students are doing. There is a huge amount of choice. I know, probably a huge surprise if you've ever seen one of my shows before, that I have choice built into what's happening in my classroom. The reason I have choice built into what students are doing is for 3 reasons. Because when it's choice, they can do what they're capable of. And that means that the work will automatically be at their independent level because they're choosing to do something. And most often students will choose to not do something that's too hard for them. There are a few, but for the most part, they'll choose something that they're capable of doing. It also means that because they have the choice and they've selected it, that the work that they're doing is going to be a bit more meaningful and engaging for their students. And I need to make sure that what I'm getting them to do is beyond that busy work threshold, that they do think that there's a purpose and a meaning behind what they're doing, because kids, especially at this age, can simply really see through busy work that they think you're just doing so that you can do other things. I mean, it's true, we are getting them to do it, but if they know that there's a purpose to it and it's actually going to be used and there's the reasoning behind why you're getting them to do what it is they're doing, then they will see that meaning. And at least, even if they don't really like it, they will at least see the purpose behind it. So we also have the idea that for those independent tasks, that we need to be able to meet those needs of our neediest learners. So for this, I think it's imperative that if we have a student who struggles with the penmanship and they need a piece of tech, that we do what we can to advocate that we've got devices in our classrooms for those students. For some of my students, that means that I work with the families to have students bring in their own device. I negotiate with other teachers that I can borrow and borrow and steal some of the devices from other classrooms so that I have it for those students during independent work periods. So during my language block, I find I can often work with a primary classroom, like a grade 1 classroom that might have some tech in their room, so that we can increase our tech for those students. Now, I am fortunate that I do have iPads in my classroom, and quite a few of my students have personal devices that have been supplied by the province. So that does help to alleviate some of those stressors there. And for our neediest of neediest learners that cannot sustain some of that, sustain some of this independent work. Make sure you're using very simplified story frames and things that they can do independently, and then have a whole host of activities that they could do, such as breaks and different things like building blocks and different activities that they can do for breaks. So I think that that is key as well, as some students won't be able to maintain academic tasks for very long, but they could probably do shorter sustained tasks for a shorter amount of time, and then build in some brain breaks in there, which would be acceptable tasks that still allows the rest of your class to continue working. It also means that I need to make sure that I have a schedule for my students, to make sure that students are accountable for what it is they're supposed to be doing, and allowing them to be accountable for the choices they make and empower them to be able to make those decisions without me constantly being on them. And I think that that is key, is letting go of a little bit of that control is going to help you to understand what you need in order to get guided reading established. The third component that I think you need in order to have students do independent tasks so that you can get down to the business of guided reading. And the third one is changing your expectations. Now, I used to think, and I still do in the back of my head, harbor a little bit of this feeling, if I'm completely honest, is that a student who is engaged in an independent task should sound like they're silent and should look like they're sitting in a chair at a desk working diligently. However, in my experience, the reality is this is not most of our students, and this is not the work environment that most of our students are going to be successful in. So I think we need to change what our expectations are for what independent work looks like and sounds like in our classroom. At the end of the day, our goal is to get the work done, not how the work gets done. So if the work is going to get done and it might be a little bit noisier for that student, at the end of the day, our work is still getting done. Can we create in our classrooms a culture or a system where students can design environments for themselves that are going to meet their individual needs? I know for some of my students, especially the ones that are chattiest during independent work time, it's typically because they're the ones that actually need noise to concentrate, and silence drives them crazy and is actually more distracting than a little bit of noise. But at the same time, I also have students that need silence when they're working. So then how do I manage that in the classroom? Well, for me, I talk with my students about what it is they need and under what conditions they're going to be the most successful when they're working. I will often, as asked by my students, play a little bit of studying music. I just found an album on iTunes that I can play. It's classical music that's kind of a little jazzy. It doesn't really matter. But it is played at a volume that it is quiet enough that students can still concentrate. It's slow enough so that it's not super catchy or predictive, so that they can't get distracted too much by the music. It's also loud enough that if a student is whispering to a person beside them, it's not going to carry and be quite so obvious around the room. So therefore, other students that might not be directly beside those two students whispering will not necessarily be distracted, because the music will kind of cover that low hum of whispering that might happen. And I also will allow whispering to happen in the classroom. That independent work, ideally, if I'm wanting them to go for 20 minutes, might not always mean that students are perfectly silent the entire time. Sometimes they want to ask a question or share what they're doing or be collaborative somehow. I mean, I don't want them talking the whole time, but a little bit of whispering now and then, providing it's not disturbing others, is okay with me. I also encourage those that do need silence to use noise canceling headphones or listen to white noise in a pair of headphones. If we've got a pair of headphones that they can turn on a white noise sound and allow them to sit in what would be more silent than, say, music. I also have students that literally need to listen to heavy metal while they're working. And if that is what the conditions they need to be successful, then I would much rather them design their learning environment so that they are not encroaching on somebody else's needs as a learner, but they're also meeting their own needs as well. So adjusting what that looks like. I also encourage my students to spread out around my classroom. I do have flexible seating, but that's not exactly what I mean. I want students at a variety of different visual levels. Some will stand, some will sit at tables, some will be on the floor. This automatically gets some kids out of their vision. It also means that when they're sitting at table groups, in my classroom in particular, they're not elbow to elbow with somebody else where it's much easier to be distracted. I will have students sit and turn into corners, hide behind tables, sit beside my desk, spread out amongst the classroom so that they're using all of the utilizable space in the room, so that they're not on top of one another at their desks, always sharing that same workspace. So changing my idea of what students actually look like has let me take a breather on being disappointed when it's not completely silent when I'm trying to do guided reading. That's helped a little bit, if I'm honest. Now, I know that many people will probably say, but I've got blank student in my class and they've got this many needs. Again, I think a lot of us have these students in our classrooms, and it just comes down to a bit of finding what they can do and giving them tasks that they can do successfully, and then asking for support if you can get it for those students that are in your room. And sometimes letting go of the idea that maybe they don't need to be engaged 100% of the time, providing that they're not interrupting the learning of others. So for me, I hold a few things true for independent work. Number one, we got to keep talking to a whisper volume in my room. 30 centimeter voices. If you've got to talk to the person next to you, please don't interrupt their learning, but also make sure that the only person that can hear you talking to them is the person you're talking to. I also want to make sure that students are spread out because it's much easier to avoid distractions that way. We play relaxing music so it drowns out the whispering and fills the room with sound. We use earphones for both music and silence if we need to. We also make sure that our goal targets weekly and monthly. We make sure that those are clearly established so students know what's expected of them. And I also ensure that my students accept the responsibility for their own failures at being unable to make that target. And secondly, they need to learn how to manage their own time effectively and solve their own problems. And they need to accept the responsibility when they fail to meet those targets. And I think that's key. The responsibility is on your students, and it's my job to set them up to teach them these skills because these are necessary learning skills. And I'm totally okay if they're not successful. Because when they're not successful, that's an opportunity for one of those conversations where we can grow and change and make a plan. I can provide more support for them, but they have the goal of what they need to do next time. I also know that their failure is not necessarily my failure. It's theirs. And I think they need to be the ones responsible for it. You have set them up to make the choices of being successful. At some point, they need to take the reins and decide that they also are going to be successful in their own learning. And sometimes for some kids, that means that they need to have those chances of learning the hard way. If I finally get my students to work independently so I can get some semblance of guided reading happening in my classroom, what exactly does that look like, especially at the junior grades? So first, there are a few things that I focus on when I'm working with students in guided reading. Those are the comprehension pieces of the text that they're reading, making sure that they're understanding increasingly complex texts, that they're using word solving strategies to understand more complex and, say, subject specific vocabulary that might be happening within the text. We're reading more technical pieces. We're reading more descriptive and vivid stories and pieces of fiction. So we want to make sure that we understand the figurative language that might be happening in what we're reading. We can understand concepts such as theme, plot, and character development, not always the literal comprehension, but we're going a little bit deeper. And we need to focus on the author's purpose and intention in their writing. So those are kind of my areas of focus. And I will often pick a key mini lesson focus that ties into the themes of what we're doing as a whole group. But I will pick a mini focus for those guided reading times with students. So what I end up doing with my students is I kind of follow the same process each time. So I choose a text that's going to relate to my overall theme that might be happening that month. I choose a text that is going to be topical, that's going to be current with students. And I am often choosing my own texts. I'll either pull them from one of my resources that I have, or I will also find newspaper articles that are often generally written at a junior level to start. And I will take those texts and I'll often put them into the app readability and level that text to ensure that it's written at the right reading level. I will also adjust that text so that I can have a high and low reading level so that I can use the same text for multiple reading levels in my room. I will normally do a high, low, and a medium for students that are either approaching, at, or beyond grade level. And I don't have to do any of that. I can also simply just go to my book room and choose the texts that are provided by my school or provided by whatever resource I happen to have, and I can simply just use those as well. There doesn't have to necessarily be this bigger plan or idea. I can just simply have a text that I think would be a good example of teaching a different skill. So when I call my students over to guided reading, the first thing I do is I have them all there and I give them a very brief introduction to the text, and then I ask them to begin to read the text independently. Now, they're reading it independently in their heads. I'm not doing any round robin reading where we're all taking turns reading. I want them to be reading it independently in their heads, except for when I'm going to lean into one of my students, and that is the signal for them that when I lean towards their spot at my guided reading table, that is a signal for them to begin whisper reading wherever they happen to be in the text. I want them to begin whisper reading to me. When I'm listening to them whisper reading, I have a copy of the text myself. They're reading the text to me in a whisper voice so as not to be completely disruptive to those who are also reading different places in the text around them. And I have them whisper reading, and while they're doing that, I am making notes on their fluency and decoding their word solving strategies and overall just their skills at being able to read the words that are on the page. So that's kind of my very first task. And I go through I have one of those horseshoe tables, and I go through my guided reading group and I lean in and listen to each and every student reading before they finish the text. Now, I'm only listening to perhaps a paragraph or perhaps less if I'm pretty confident that they're doing okay. More if I think, oh, there's a few errors in there, let me continue to listen to them and kind of see what types of errors they are making. And I will often reference the little chart in the back of the DRA, and I'm sure other standardized reading level programs have this as well. But it gives you kind of like strengths and weaknesses of students with different reading behaviors. And I kind of pay attention to where students are on that matrix. And then I will make notes about students' strengths and weaknesses when it comes to decoding and their fluency and expression while reading. Once I have listened to all students and I've made little notes, Then they will be finishing their reading, and that's when I begin to ask them some questions where I really want to get them to understand what the gist is of what they're reading. They should be quickly summarizing the text, understanding the main plot points, understanding what the problem is, what the solution is, who the main character was, where the setting took place. I want them to understand the mechanical features of that text. I want them to know what the nonfiction text features are, what they're seeing, what the author's purpose was. I want them to kind of look at some of the technical pieces of the piece of text that we are reading. So the first section of after they've read the text is we're kind of looking at some of the technical pieces of the writing and deconstructing what it is they read. Once we have done that, and I don't spend a ton of time, I just kind of quickly go through that as to what the gist is, who the main character was, just making sure that I have an idea that students did understand and comprehend the gist or the summary of the story. Next, we begin to focus on digging a little deeper because a lot of the skills at the junior level, if you've got junior level readers, the skills at the junior level have a much stronger focus on digging a little bit beyond the literal understanding of the text. And I find as students transition from, say, grade 4 to grade 6, their ability to analyze and interpret texts grows exponentially. So I really want to foster that level of understanding so that they can start to dig deeper and understand concepts of theme and making deeper connections, understanding inferences, synthesizing information where they're pulling in concepts from different parts of the book, as well as really digging into kind of the plot, the theme that is happening beyond just the key ideas of a summary or a retell. Overall, my goals when I'm doing guided reading are I'm looking for things like, can they read with good fluency, decoding, and expression? Where are they tripping up on words? Is it endings? Are they skipping words? Are they inserting things? Are they missing things when they're reading? What are some of the common errors that they're making when they're simply just reading out loud? I also want to know what kind of strategies they are using to solve word problems. Are they using context? So they're just substituting words, but the sentence still makes sense, which I might not be concerned about. Or are they completely skipping over key words, which is going to then interfere with comprehension later on? I really want to focus on what they're doing when they do come across words or phrases in their reading that they don't understand and how they're solving those problems. I also want to make sure that students understand how to summarize what it is that they're reading, both a fiction and nonfiction, and that they understand kind of the gist and the main kind of structure of the plot that they're reading. And finally, the big idea for junior for me is whether or not they can analyze and interpret what it is they're reading and read beyond that literal understanding of the text. So those are definitely my goals when I am reading. Now, this is typically for students that are working at about a DRA 30 and above. This is where, so if I've got students that are approaching, say, grade 4, then these are kind of the activities I'm doing. For those group of students, which I inevitably will have, that might be reading at a much lower level, I definitely rely more on, say, primary level understanding of what guided reading looks like, where we're really focusing more on the basic fluency and decoding skills and looking at those at what level those students are working at. So for guided reading, it's really important to do guided reading for a lot of reasons, but at the same time, it's also really difficult because really what you're doing is you're spinning a lot of plates at the same time. You've got a group of students that are working independently, and you've got to manage that without being there. And you also have a group of students that are in front of you that you are assessing and deciding what their skills and strengths are as readers. So some of the things that I think we need to remember. Guided reading will never run perfectly. And if it does, it's time to buy a lottery ticket because I'm not sure that it's always going to be run perfectly. It often is never perfect. And that means whether the guided reading group in front of you is perfect or whether or not you've got kids working independently that are not always working. It's never going to be perfect. But you also may not ever follow your schedule as perfectly as you laid it out in your plan book, and that's okay too. You're doing the best you can do. I rarely can get through the perfect plan that I have laid out, but I do what I can and I just make an effort. And I've got to be okay if I can get it like 70% of the time. That's a win. 60% of the time is a win. If I can accomplish what I set out to do 60% of the time, I'm teaching human beings. So things are going to change and things are going to come up. So I have to be adaptable and I have to take it easy on myself when it doesn't go perfectly. I also need to remember that not every kid in my room is going to be focused and working 100% of the time while I'm engaged in guided reading. And I need to let them be responsible for the consequences of their actions and understand that their failure is not my failure. I need to be able to coach them through that and not just kind of let them flounder. But I definitely need to be okay that if I have somebody who's just not doing it, I have the skills to encourage them to continue to grow and to move forward and to keep going and to get better next time. And making them accountable for the decision to be unfocused while they're working. So group your students, put them in groups, put them in guided reading groups, base them on ability, plan some easy but highly engaging choice level activities for independent work for the rest of your students. Pick a text for your guided reading level, work with that small group, listen to them reading, take assessment notes, and then repeat it. And do the best that you can do. And good luck. It is an effective way to teach reading, but that doesn't mean it's the easiest way to teach reading. So if you are wondering where the best place to find this video or all of the other previous videos for Teaching with Inquiry Live, I want you to go to the website www.teachingwithinquiry.com. There you're going to find a post for every single episode that I've put together for this show, and it has within each post has links to the YouTube video, to the podcast, as well as a transcript for each of these episodes. And we'll also link to a blog post if there is one on my main site, madlylearning.com. That is the best and easiest way to find all future or all past resources. Facebook doesn't really give me the greatest opportunity to source out that information. So if you want to find previous videos and see all of the other topics that we've talked about, the best place to find that is at www.teachingwithinquiry.com. And thank you so much for joining me. And if you've got any questions or want to talk more about guided reading, please leave a comment below in this video and we can chat all night long about guided reading and guided reading instruction. So thanks very much for joining me, and I will see you next week, and happy Halloween. Bye for now.